The general insisted on marrying the eldest daughter of the Wen family, who had been a military prostitute in Beidi for 3 years. She had already been tormented to the point of madness, picking up all sorts of bad habits. She also had a tendency to steal things and would scream if anyone came near her. One of her legs was crippled, and she staggered clumsily when she walked. I reminded him, "General, marrying a wife like this will invite ridicule from everyone." Wei Lin smiled at me and replied, "Nanny, she is Wen Jiao." Of course, I knew she was Wen Jiao, the same Wen Jiao who once captivated the capital as the most talented and beautiful woman. But that was 3 years ago. Wen Jiao entered the household as a concubine. She came in through the side gate, carried in on a simple red sedan chair. Neither family held a wedding banquet. The master didn't want such a crazed woman walking through the front gate, fearing it would bring shame to the Wei family. Honestly, I don't blame him for thinking that way. After all, Wen Jiao is now the laughingstock of the entire capital. She was found in a Beidi military camp for prostitutes, a place that was nothing short of hell. It was filthy, foul-smelling, and the women were chained together like livestock. Various torture devices hung on the walls, long needles to pierce their nails, branding irons, gags. Any woman who disobeyed would face brutal punishment. No matter how strong her will, any woman would break under such torment. That's what Xiao Lu, one of the general's aides, told me. When talking about that place, he couldn't stop shaking his head. Hell, that place was worse than hell itself. The Beidi people are truly vicious in their ways of torturing others. They didn't treat them like humans, not even like animals. When our troops stormed the camp and saw the horrors inside, not a single man dared to step in. In the end, it was the general who led the way, covering those women with his cloak and bringing them out. 3 years ago, Shen was defeated and offered 3,000 women to Beidi. But in the end, only 53 returned alive. Now, Wen Jiao is the only one still alive. The other 52 women died mysteriously within a month of their return. Some took their own lives, others died from sudden illnesses, and some vanished without a trace. Each case was covered up with official excuses, masking the truth as these women were thrown back into hell after escaping the Beidi wolves. Wen Jiao survived only because the general visited the Wen household daily, leaving her family no chance to act. Wei Lin once believed that rescuing those women from Beidi would mean they were safe. But he underestimated the power of gossip and the weight of societal norms. Aside from their time as military prostitutes in Beidi, which ruined their reputations, they couldn't marry and would only bring shame to their families. Moreover, their mere existence was a constant reminder of Shen's humiliating defeat and subjugation to Beidi. They had used their bodies, even their lives, to buy 3 years of peace for Shen. But as Shen grew stronger over those 3 years, their existence became a source of shame. The deaths of the 52 women were silent, with not even a whisper of suspicion. Wei Lin learned of this by accident. That day, he had worked late, but he couldn't stop thinking about Wen Jiao. Her condition was so unstable, and Wei Lin feared frightening her. He decided to sneak into the Wen residence, hoping to catch a distant glimpse of her. Unexpectedly, that glimpse allowed him to witness the servants forcing Wen Jiao to drink medicine. She was thrashing about wildly, desperately resisting. An old servant sighed, "Miss, just drink it. This medicine works slowly, and in 10 days or so, you won't suffer anymore." Another servant spat at her. Still think you're the eldest daughter, don't you? The others are dead, and yet you have the nerve to stay alive. The Wen family's reputation is in ruins because of you. Second miss is cursed to have you as her sister. Hurry up and die already, so you don't ruin her marriage. After Wen Jiao was sent to Beidi, her younger sister, Wenya, took her place as the capital's most talented lady. Now, everyone only knows of the Wen family's second daughter, Wenya, and not her elder sister, Wen Jiao. Wenya has reached marriageable age, and with such a mentally unstable sister, it would certainly affect her prospects. Sisterly affection? It's nothing but a matter of personal gain. Wei Lin, seething with rage, drew his sword and cut off the hand of the wicked servant. Blood splattered, and the man clutched his arm, rolling on the ground, screaming in pain. Pointing his sword at the other servant, Wei Lin demanded angrily, "Who ordered you to treat her this way?" The old servant trembled as he knelt. "Spare me, General. I've watched Miss grow up, and I didn't want this either. But the master and madam gave strict orders that she must die within half a month. You visit her every day, and if she dies suddenly, it would be too suspicious, so we were ordered to use slow poison. We had no choice. Their very existence is a disgrace to Shen and their families. The others are already dead. She has to die too, to preserve the Wen family's reputation." Wei Lin was stunned. He pressed further. "Who are the others you're talking about?" The old servant was trembling uncontrollably. "That the other women you brought back from Beidi. Now only Miss is still alive." The sword fell to the ground with a clatter. Wei Lin staggered back 2 steps, his whole body trembling, almost collapsing. That night, Wei Lin brought Wen Jiao back to the Wei residence in the middle of the night. Xiao Lu tiptoed to knock on my door. "Nanny, hurry, something big has happened." I quickly threw on some clothes and followed him to Wei Lin's room. The air inside was thick with the stench of blood, so overwhelming it made me nauseous. Suppressing the urge to retch, I took a few steps inside. Wei Lin's room was simply furnished, without any excess decorations, screens, or curtains. The moment I looked up, I saw Wen Jiao lying on the bed, her body drenched in blood. I rushed over. How did she get such serious injuries? Wei Lin clutched his chest and said hoarsely, "She's just asleep. The blood is mine." It was only then that I noticed his chest, where blood was still steadily seeping out, his face unnaturally pale. I was horrified. Who on earth could wound you like this? With Wei Lin's skills, no one in Shen could rival him, not even the notoriously fierce Beidi warriors. To injure him this badly, it had to be something beyond human. Wei Lin gritted his teeth, enduring the pain, and said shakily, "She did. Clean her up and change her clothes. I'll go find a doctor for my wounds." Wei Lin forced himself to stand, and Xiao Lu quickly followed him out. Once I had finished changing Wen Jiao's clothes, Xiao Lu sneaked back in. He explained the situation to me, sighing at the end. The general wanted to carry Wen Jiao back, but she was so terrified of the Wen family that she screamed and grabbed the general's sword off the ground, stabbing him fiercely. The general couldn't bear to hurt her, so he let her stab him. In the end, I had to knock her out with a single blow to bring her back. By the time it was late into the night, and we were still keeping watch over Wen Jiao, Wei Lin hadn't returned. I nudged Xiao Lu, who was snoring loudly, and asked, "Where's the general getting treated? Why is he taking so long to come back?" Xiao Lu smacked his forehead. "I totally forgot. After I accompanied the general to the clinic, he asked me where he could buy incense. Could he have gone to the burial grounds in the middle of the night to pay his respects to those dead women? This is bad." The burial grounds were deep in the mountains, the path steep and treacherous. If it were the usual Wei Lin, we wouldn't be worried, but now that he was severely injured, who knows what might happen? I quickly grabbed 2 torches and headed up the mountain with Xiao Lu to find him. Thankfully, the moonlight tonight was bright. The full moon hung high in the sky, casting a clear, silvery light over the landscape. When we found Wei Lin, he was sitting on the ground, drinking. Beside him was a pile of incense paper burning in a fierce, bright flame, the yellow firelight flickering and dancing. His expression was as cold as ice. Xiao Lu murmured, "The general must be feeling so guilty right now." He said that after they rescued the women, a few of them tried to escape in the middle of the night. The other soldiers thought they were assassins and brought them to the general's tent for interrogation, only to find they were the women they had just saved. The women knelt before him, pleading, "General, we can't go back. We mustn't go back. If we return, we'll die. We've endured humiliation, living like animals just to survive until now. We've been dishonored for 3 years here. If we go back, we'll surely be killed." Wei Lin had helped them up, comforting them. "That won't happen. You are the heroes of Shen. When I left for battle, your parents and brothers came to the Wei residence, bringing gifts and asking me to make sure you all came home. They miss you dearly. What he said wasn't a lie. Before Wei Lin set out for war, many families whose daughters had been taken to Beidi had indeed come to the Wei residence, bringing gifts. Among the 3,000 women, many were the daughters of minor officials or merchants. But Wei Lin was too young and too confident, unable to see the complexities of the situation. He didn't understand that many of those families only pretended to miss their daughters, using the opportunity to offer gifts and build connections with the Wei family. Normally, they wouldn't have had the chance to forge ties with the Wei family, so why not take advantage of this opportunity? In truth, they were likely hoping their daughters were already dead. Having a daughter who had been a military prostitute in a foreign land was worse than having no daughter at all. The night sky was clear, the moon shining brightly. The night wind blew in gusts, tousling Wei Lin's hair. He tipped his head back, gulping down more wine, but accidentally choked, leading to a violent coughing fit. The coughing pulled at his wound, staining the freshly wrapped white bandages with blood. Xiao Lu rushed over, crying, "General, please stop drinking." Wei Lin smashed the wine jar on the ground and burst into laughter. But as he laughed, tears began to fall. He laughed bitterly. "I thought when they saw their daughters had suffered so much, they'd be heartbroken and take good care of them. 3 years in that hellhole, and they didn't die there, but less than a month after coming back to Sheng, they all died. They were killed by their own families, the people they trusted and loved the most. Isn't that just laughable? What is right and what is wrong? Was bringing those women back the right choice or the wrong one? No one can say." I walked over and tried to console him. "General, this isn't your fault. This is the way of the world. Women who lose their purity will be scorned by all. It's their fate." Wei Lin sneered. "The way of the world? The way of the world is nonsense. If this is truly the way, then I will turn it upside down." I was stunned. When Wei Lin said this, he sounded just like the late Madame Shen. Madame Shen had truly raised both him and the eldest daughter well. I sighed, thinking of Madame Shen, and felt a deep sorrow well up inside me. This section continues the narrative while adhering to the guidelines of maintaining the original meaning, ensuring clarity, and keeping the language natural. 6. Wei Lin's birth mother, Lady Shen, had been kind to me. When my daughter was born, she was drowned right after birth. She was so delicate, soft, and pink, but they held her under the water in a wooden tub and killed her. I screamed and cried hysterically. My in-laws coldly said, "The firstborn must be a boy. Girls bring bad luck. Boys carry the family's young energy, while girls are yin." I was filled with rage. Once I had recovered a little, I packed my things and ran away. After wandering for a while, I ended up at the Wei residence, working as a maid by Lady Shen's side. But not long after, my husband's family found me. They wanted to take me back. Everyone said that since I had run away from my husband's home, I ought to be returned. It was Lady Shen who intervened on my behalf, allowing me to stay. She was incredibly beautiful, with brows like ink and eyes like autumn water. She often spoke of things like the feudal system, equality for all, and women's rights. I didn't understand any of it, but I knew that Lady Shen was kind to everyone. At first, Lord Wei and Lady Shen had a strong relationship, but everything changed when Lu Mantang appeared. I frequently saw Lady Shen in tears. Lu Mantang often provoked her. "Do you really think you can compete with a noblewoman groomed for over a decade by one of the most powerful families?" Lady Shen would just smile. "I never intended to compete with anyone." 7. During that time, Lady Shen would often look up at the ink-black sky and sigh, saying she wanted to return. I asked her where she wanted to return to, but she only smiled and said nothing. After a while, she asked me, "Yuan, do you think it's laughable when I talk about equality for all and women's rights?" I hesitated for a moment before replying honestly. "Madam, we were raised with the beliefs that men are superior to women and that imperial power is absolute. When you suddenly speak like this, it's hard for us to understand." I didn't dare say her words were foolish, but they were ideas we had never even dared to think about. Lady Shen gazed distantly into the horizon and, after a long silence, said, Before I came here, I often read novels, and without exception, they always portrayed women who time traveled as foolish and incompetent. Meanwhile, noble women were depicted as exceedingly clever, using their power and influence to orchestrate the time traveler's tragic downfall. But even back then, I still hoped the time-traveling women would win, because the novels portrayed equality as absurd, while imperial power and family hierarchies were portrayed as sacred and unchangeable. But I thought, no matter how foolish these women are, perhaps something they say might spark change, like a flame kindling someone's thoughts in the future. Maybe one day, someone will raise their voice and shout, "Are kings and nobles born superior?" That's far better than noble women flaunting class superiority. So, even knowing I'd be mocked, I still said these things. I was willing to play the role of the foolish time traveler in the novels. That day, Lady Shen said many things, none of which I truly understood. Later, Lady Shen fell gravely ill. On her deathbed, she held my hand and said, "Ayuan, I only trust you in the Wei family. Please take care of Ayun and Alan for me. They're still young, their minds haven't fully formed. Don't teach them about equality like I did. Those ideas don't work here. You must teach Ayun to follow the virtues of submission, modesty, and obedience. Teach Alan the proper conduct between ruler and subject and the 5 constants. Only then will they survive in this world. Especially Ayun, she's a girl. Life will be even harder for her. You'll have to spend extra effort teaching her how to survive." Lady Shen was different from everyone else here. But when she died, it was as if she had finally understood something, as if she had been assimilated into this world in the end. At that time, Wei Lin was only 7 and Wei Yin was 12. Wei Yin was perceptive and intelligent. After witnessing her mother's tragic death, she matured quickly. She entered the palace and navigated it carefully, eventually becoming empress. But Wei Lin, no matter how much I tried to teach him, he only believed in the principles Lady Shen had taught him. 8. The next day, Wei Lin requested to marry Wen Jiao in the imperial court. The court was in an uproar. Prime Minister Wei even publicly scolded him, "You ungrateful child, stop speaking nonsense. Marriage has always been arranged by parental decree and the words of a matchmaker. How dare you think you can decide?" Wei Lin sneered, "Father, wasn't the engagement between Jiao and me something you arranged yourself?" Lady Shen passed away early, and I had watched Wei Lin grow up. His engagement to Wen Jiao had been arranged long ago. Back then, he wasn't yet the famed general of the state. And Wen Jiao wasn't the despised prostitute from Beidi. At that time, Wen Jiao was like her name, pure as the moon in the sky. She was the capital's #1 talent and acknowledged as the most beautiful woman. Her skills on the zither were unrivaled, and every year during the spring festival, she represented the goddess and played the zither on the phoenix platform to offer prayers. Her calligraphy and poetry were equally extraordinary, with people willing to pay fortunes for a piece of her work. Countless scholars wrote poems praising her, comparing her to an immortal descended from the heavens or likening her to the pure and unblemished moon. She seemed like a goddess, admired by all, and whenever she went out, crowds would gather just to catch a glimpse. The Wen family and the Wei family had been close for generations, and the two had grown up together. Wei Lin was lively and loved horse riding, archery, and martial arts, spending most of his time in the training grounds. Wen Jiao, on the other hand, was gentle and spent her days in her boudoir practicing the zither and painting. She only ventured out occasionally for poetry gatherings or when invited to events hosted by noble ladies in the capital. Despite their stark differences, they were deeply drawn to one another. Wen Jiao would paint and write poems for Wei Lin's fan, while Wei Lin would bring her all sorts of unusual trinkets, bamboo dragonflies, clay figurines, sugar sculptures. He never ran out of ways to amuse her. Later, the master arranged their marriage in advance. Had they waited until Wen Jiao came of age, the number of suitors would have trampled down their threshold, and even the Wei family might not have been able to secure the marriage. By that time, Wei Yun had already entered the palace as a favored concubine. The biggest concern was that in the next selection of palace maidens, if the Wen family sent Wen Jiao into the palace, Wei Yun might lose favor. By arranging the engagement, they not only strengthened the bond between the two families, but also eliminated a potential threat to Wei Yun. Though there was calculation behind it, the engagement between Wei Lin and Wen Jiao was real. 9. The engagement was tacitly cancelled 3 years ago when she was sent to the northern tribes. Prime Minister Wei's eyes blazed with anger. Wei Lin sneered. Tacitly cancelled? Who decided that? The Prime Minister, enraged, bellowed. You, filial Shen. Stop spouting nonsense. If you dare to bring a northern tribe's camp whore home, I'll bash my head in. As it seemed that bloodshed between father and son was imminent, the emperor finally spoke. He tried to reason with Wei Lin. The prime minister is not wrong. Even though Wen Jiao was once celebrated, that was in the past. She is now nothing more than a prostitute from the northern tribes. Given your status as the general of Shen, I think only Princess Xiaohua is worthy of you. At the mention of Princess Xiaohua, Wei Lin's expression darkened instantly. 3 years ago, it was supposed to be Princess Xiaohua who married into the northern tribes. At that time, the northern tribes had only demanded 50 million taels of silver and a princess for the marriage, without asking for 3,000 tribute women. But no one had expected that halfway there, Princess Xiaohua would flee the marriage. She returned to Qing state, clutching the emperor's leg, crying and begging not to go. Her escape was a colossal humiliation to the northern tribes, who immediately mobilized their army, vowing to crush Qing state. Some suggested sending Princess Xiaohua back at once. Others argued that she lacked beauty and talent, and that returning her would not appease the wrath of the northern tribe's king. What kind of woman would satisfy him? Everyone thought of Wen Jiao. Even though Wen Darren was unwilling, imperial orders couldn't be defied. That night, Wen Jiao was drugged and stuffed into the bridal sedan heading to the northern tribes. The king of the northern tribes was overjoyed and decided not to pursue the matter of the princess's escape further. But after experiencing the beauty and tenderness of Qing state's women, he was so pleased that he demanded another 3,000 tribute women for his soldiers. 10. Princess Xiaohua had been raised in luxury, enjoying the tribute of all people. Yet, at a critical moment, she shirked her responsibility as a princess, abandoning her duty and leaving 3,000 families in Qing state torn apart. Wen Jiao and the 3,000 women bore the punishment for her, yet she felt no remorse. At a palace banquet, she even boasted to other noble women, "I heard that Wen Jiao is suffering over there. She's so stubborn, refusing to submit to the northern tribe's king, and in the end, he got tired of her and threw her into the soldiers' camp as a prostitute." It's hilarious. These so-called talented women are just pretentious. She could have pleased the king and lived in luxury, but she chose to suffer instead. Wei Lin, seated at a nearby table, crushed his wine cup in fury. After the banquet, he knocked out the 2 palace maids by Princess Xiaohua's side and pressed a dagger to her throat against the wall. Wei Lin had drunk a lot. Leaning close to her face, he gritted his teeth and warned, "If you ever slander Wen Jiao again, I will take your life." Standing so close, Princess Xiaohua blushed deeply. She even forgot that she was being threatened and shyly muttered, okay. Wei Lin had inherited Lady Shen's stunning looks and was incredibly handsome. Even beside the famously beautiful Wen Jiao, many acclaimed handsome men paled in comparison. Only when Wei Lin stood next to her did people marvel at their perfect match, like a pair made in heaven. If he didn't spend all his time practicing archery and riding, but instead frequented literary gatherings like other noblemen, he might have been recognized as the most elegant gentleman in the capital by now. Since then, Princess Xiaohua had repeatedly used the excuse of wanting to practice archery to visit the training grounds to see him. But Wei Lin, focused entirely on military training, ignored her. The emperor later sought to arrange a marriage for Princess Xiaohua, but she insisted on marrying Wei Lin. Wen Jiao was Wei Lin's fiancé, and the emperor still felt a twinge of guilt for sending her to the northern tribes. He couldn't openly force the marriage, so he subtly hinted that if Wei Lin married Princess Xiaohua, the rule preventing sons-in-law from holding office could be waived. Wei Lin pretended not to understand and repeatedly refused. As a result, Princess Xiaohua had now reached the age of 20 and remained unmarried. 11. Now, once again, the emperor hinted that only Princess Xiaohua could match him. Still, Wei Lin remained silent. Turning to face the court officials, he stated clearly, "I just learned yesterday that of the 53 women I rescued from the northern tribes, only Wen Jiao remains alive." The cruel irony is that none of the 3 years of torment from the northern tribes could break their will to live. Do any of you know what it feels like to have a long needle driven through your fingers? Have you tasted the agony of torn flesh and broken bones? If those women hadn't gone to the northern tribes 3 years ago, would you still be here, clothed in fine robes, debating right and wrong? Your Majesty, would your throne still be secure? Wei Lin sneered. The prostitute you speak of bore the responsibility of a princess and protected the peace of Shang state for 3 years. Why is she unworthy of marrying me? The court officials looked at one another in embarrassment. Wei Lin had just torn away their last shred of dignity. They were nothing but cowards who had used women to secure peace for the nation. His words were a clear violation of decorum, and the emperor's face immediately darkened. Prime Minister Wei turned pale. Afraid that Wei Lin might say something even more damaging, he quickly intervened. "Your Majesty, my son spoke rashly due to his youth and temper, a failing in my upbringing." Tugging at Wei Lin's sleeve, he whispered, "To marry, you need the emperor's blessing and a formal wedding with 3 letters and 6 rites, which would take at least a month. A concubine, on the other hand, requires far fewer ceremonies. A simple sedan can bring her home immediately. I permit you to take her as a concubine. Don't think I don't know you've already brought Wen Jiao back to the Wei residence. Would you really feel safe sending her back to the Wen family? If not for the Wei family, then at least consider your sister. She's carrying your nephew." While this was merely a temporary concession from the Prime Minister to pacify Wei Lin, his words were also true. Now that the Wen family harbored murderous intent toward Wen Jiao, it was impossible to send her back. And with the deep bond between Wei Lin and his sister, he couldn't bear to see her struggling in the palace either.
9.
When the marriage contract was tacitly cancelled 3 years ago when she was sent to the northern tribes, Prime Minister Wei glared angrily. Wei Lin sneered. "Tacit? Who agreed to that?" The Prime Minister exploded in rage.
You
rebellious son. Stop saying such things. If you dare bring a northern tribe's military prostitute home, I'll bash my head in right here. Just as it seemed the father and son were about to spill blood in the palace, the emperor finally spoke. He advised Wei Lin, "I think the Prime Minister has a point. Although Wen Jiao was once respected, that was in the past. Now, she's nothing but a prostitute from the northern tribes. You are now the general of the nation, Wei Lin. I believe only Princess Xiaohua is worthy of you." At the mention of Princess Xiaohua, Wei Lin's expression darkened instantly. 3 years ago, it was supposed to be Princess Xiaohua who was sent to the northern tribes for marriage. At that time, the northern tribes only asked for 50 million taels of silver and a princess to marry, without demanding 3,000 tribute women from Shen Kingdom. But no one expected that halfway through the journey, Princess Xiaohua would escape. She fled back to Shen Kingdom, crying and clutching the emperor's leg, wailing that she didn't want to marry. Her escape was a tremendous insult to the northern tribes. They immediately sent troops, vowing to flatten Shen Kingdom. Some suggested sending Princess Xiaohua back right away. Others said that since Princess Xiaohua was average in both appearance and talent, sending her back wouldn't be enough to quell the northern tribe's king's fury. But who could possibly be a match for such an extraordinary beauty? Everyone thought of Wen Jiao. Although Lord Wen was reluctant, the emperor's decree was final. That night, Wen Jiao was drugged and placed in a wedding sedan bound for the northern tribes. The northern tribe's king was overjoyed and decided not to pursue the matter of the princess's escape. But after savoring the beauty of the women from Shen Kingdom, he was so satisfied that he demanded an additional 3,000 tribute women for his soldiers' pleasure.
10.
Princess Xiaohua had lived a life of luxury since childhood, supported by the people. At the critical moment, however, she shirked her duty, fleeing from marriage and causing 3,000 families to be torn apart. Wen Jiao and the 3,000 women from Shen Kingdom bore the consequences of her actions, but she felt no remorse. She even boasted at a palace banquet to other noble women, "I heard that when Jiao's life over there was miserable." She was too stubborn to submit to the northern tribe's king, and in the end, he lost patience with her and sent her to the military camp as a prostitute. Haha, serves her right. These so-called talented women are just fake. They could have lived comfortably by pleasing the northern tribe's king, but they just had to make life difficult for themselves. Wei Lin, seated at a nearby banquet table, crushed his wine cup in anger. After the banquet, he knocked out the two maids attending Princess Xiaohua, pulled out a dagger, and pressed her against the wall. Wei Lin had drunk heavily. He leaned close to her face, gritting his teeth as he warned, "If you dare speak ill of Wen Jiao again, I will take your life." Standing too close, Princess Xiaohua's face flushed. Forgetting she was being threatened, she shyly responded, "All right, okay." Wei Lin had inherited Lady Shen's beauty, making him strikingly handsome. Even a beauty like Wen Jiao paled in comparison to him. Only when standing side by side with Wei Lin did one truly feel they were a match made in heaven. Had he not spent his days riding horses, practicing archery, and training in martial arts, but instead attended poetry gatherings like other young men, he would surely be the most famous and refined gentleman in the capital. After that, Princess Xiaohua made several attempts to see Wei Lin at the training grounds under the pretext of practicing riding and archery. But Wei Lin was completely focused on military training and ignored her. Later, the emperor wanted to marry off Princess Xiaohua, but she refused to marry anyone but Wei Lin. Wen Jiao had been Wei Lin's fiancé, and sending her to the northern tribes left the emperor feeling somewhat guilty. Unable to openly force a marriage, the emperor hinted many times that if Wei Lin married Princess Xiaohua, he would break the rule that forbade a prince consort from holding office in the court. But Wei Lin pretended not to understand and refused repeatedly. Now, Princess Xiaohua was 20 years old and still unmarried. 11. This time, when the emperor again hinted that only Princess Xiaohua was worthy of him, it was another subtle suggestion for Wei Lin to marry her. Wei Lin remained silent. He turned to the court officials and spoke slowly. "Yesterday, I learned that of the 53 women I rescued from the northern tribes, only Wen Jiao is still alive. The tragic part is that, despite 3 years of torture, they never lost hope of survival. Do any of you know what it feels like to have needles pierced through your fingers? Or what it's like to endure the agony of torn flesh and broken bones? If they hadn't gone to the northern tribes 3 years ago, would you still be standing here today, wearing your fine clothes and debating right from wrong in this court? Your Majesty, would you still be seated safely on your throne?" Wei Lin scoffed. "The northern tribe's prostitute you scorn fulfilled the duties of a princess and protected Shen Kingdom's peace for 3 years. How could she not be worthy of me?" The court officials exchanged uneasy glances. Wei Lin had just stripped away their last shred of dignity. In truth, they were nothing more than cowards who relied on women to win peace for the kingdom. His words were deeply disrespectful, and the emperor's face darkened immediately. Prime Minister Wei turned pale. Fearing that Wei Lin might say something worse, he quickly intervened. "Your Majesty, my son is young and hot-headed, speaking recklessly. It is my failure to teach him properly." He tugged at Wei Lin's sleeve and whispered, "To take a wife requires the emperor's decree, a formal wedding, and the proper rituals, all of which will take at least a month. But taking a concubine doesn't require as much ceremony. You can marry her in a small sedan right away. I'll allow you to make her your concubine. Don't think I don't know you've secretly brought Wen Jiao back to the Wei household. Are you comfortable sending her back to the Wen family? If not for the sake of the Wei family, would you not at least consider your sister? She's carrying your nephew." Though Prime Minister Wei was only trying to placate Wei Lin for the moment, what he said wasn't entirely wrong. Now that the Wen family had murderous intentions toward Wen Jiao, sending her back would be out of the question. And Wei Lin shared a deep bond with his sister, Wei Yun, so he couldn't bear to see her struggling in the palace. 15. It wasn't until her emotions finally calmed that Wei Lin gently lifted her and carried her back to the Wei family estate. While the doctor bandaged him up, he shook his head repeatedly, saying, "She put all her strength into that bite, as if aiming to kill you. If she had bitten into a major artery in your neck, your life would have been in grave danger." The country's fearsome general, who struck terror into the hearts of enemies on the battlefield, had now nearly died twice at the hands of a woman. It was quite ironic. Wei Lin touched the white gauze wrapped around his neck. His eyes darkened. She must have suffered greatly in northern D. The doctor glanced at Wen Jiao, who was curled up in a corner, trembling. He said nothing more and left. I saw them both hadn't eaten much since morning, so I brought 2 bowls of corn and pork rib soup from the kitchen. The aroma of the pork ribs made Wen Jiao's eyes light up. She swallowed her saliva and nervously glanced at Wei Lin. He smiled helplessly, took one of the bowls, and squatted in front of her. "Ah, Jiao, let me feed you, okay?" Wen Jiao didn't respond, but in her impatience, she reached into the bowl to grab a rib. The soup had just been taken off the stove, and the temperature was high. She withdrew her hand quickly after getting burned. Wei Lin hurriedly put down the bowl and grabbed her hand to inspect it. I handed him the burn ointment I had prepared earlier. Wei Lin gently wiped her hand clean and applied the ointment. A section of her arm was exposed, covered in scars of varying sizes. When I changed her clothes last time, I had noticed that her body was covered in old wounds. Her face was likely the only part of her body without scars. Perhaps even the people of Northern D couldn't bear to ruin such a beautiful face. Wei Lin's gaze lingered on the scars on her arm. Wen Jiao bit her lip and stared at him blankly for a long time before whispering, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have bitten you." Wei Lin's eyelashes trembled. "Do you know who I am?" Wen Jiao shook her head. He asked again, "Do you know who you are?" Once again, she shook her head. 16. Wei Lin asked me to bring a new set of bedding. Wen Jiao is terrified of people, especially men, so Wei Lin dared not sleep in the same bed as her. But he also wanted to be by her side all the time, so he prepared to sleep on the floor next to her bed. When I entered the room, Wei Lin was feeding her medicine. I wasn't sure how long he had coaxed her, but this time Wen Jiao didn't resist. She obediently drank the medicine, one sip after another, and Wei Lin rewarded her with a piece of candy. As she tasted the sweetness of the candy, tears suddenly welled up in her eyes. Wei Lin wiped the tears from the corners of her eyes and asked in a panic, "What's wrong? Isn't the candy sweet?" Wen Jiao didn't answer. Instead, she suddenly threw the medicine bowl on the ground, shattering it, and picked up a shard. She pointed the sharp edge toward Wei Lin, her hand trembling as she cut his face. When she saw blood seeping from the wound, she immediately began retreating, backing up until her back hit the edge of the bed. She held the porcelain shard defensively, trembling. "What do you want to do to me?" she asked in a shaky voice. Wei Lin, afraid she might harm herself, quickly grabbed her wrist and took the shard from her hand. He sighed softly. "Ah, Jiao, just get some rest. If you don't want to see me, I'll go sleep outside." Wen Jiao tilted her head, her face full of confusion, and asked, "You're treating me so well. Isn't it because you want to hurt me?" My heart clenched painfully at her words. Wei Lin grasped her hand, his own trembling uncontrollably. He gently ruffled her hair, his voice shaking. "No, I just want to hear you call me Wei Lin." Wen Jiao pursed her lips, still looking puzzled. After a long pause, she finally muttered softly, "Wei Lin." Hearing her call his name again after 3 long years, Wei Lin's body trembled. I too felt my heart ache deeply. Afraid that if I stayed any longer, I might start crying, I hurriedly finished making the bed and left the room. 17. I tossed and turned in my room, unable to sleep, overwhelmed by sorrow. The Wen Jiao of the past had been so gentle and lovely, always with a soft smile on her lips. She had everything: looks, talent, family, and grace, admired by all. But now, The radiant young woman who had once been the darling of the heavens was truly gone. I couldn't even begin to imagine the torment she must have endured in Northern D. Sighing, I pushed open the door, deciding to take a walk to clear my head. Before long, I found Wei Lin sitting alone in the pavilion, drinking. Wei Lin rarely drank. He was always busy training the army day and night, and drinking could lead to mistakes. Only after winning a battle would he celebrate and drink with his brothers in the camp. When I approached, it didn't surprise me to see him already in tears. Seeing me, he smiled bitterly, as if he had finally found someone to confide in. Nanny, I hate myself so much. I hate that it took me 3 years to defeat Northern D. If I had tried harder, if I had studied military tactics day and night without rest, could I have brought Jiao home sooner? Jiao, she suffered so much. It's my fault for not protecting her. She doesn't recognize me anymore. She really doesn't know who I am. Wei Lin kept pouring wine into his mouth, and the bandages on his neck began to seep with blood again. To be honest, defeating Northern D in 3 years was already a miracle. Northern D had always been known as the strongest power in the north, with a formidable military. Most of the neighboring countries around Shen had been its vassals. Wei Lin had used a strategy of picking off these countries one by one, cutting off Northern D's reinforcements, before launching a final assault on their capital. At the time, Shen was weak and impoverished, with a neglected military. Some had even predicted it would take at least 20 years to defeat Northern D. The fact that Wei Lin accomplished it in 3 was remarkable. But I didn't know how to comfort him. Perhaps when you love someone, no matter how much you do, it never feels like enough. 18. After defeating the Beidi, with no wars requiring military deployment, the army's training schedule loosened. Wei Lin used all the extra time he could muster to stay by Wen Jiao's side. I never thought a man could be so attentive. In all my years, I've only ever seen wives meticulously care for their husbands, never the other way around. When I was in confinement after childbirth, my lower body hurt so much that I couldn't even get out of bed. My husband would leave a bowl of cold rice by my bedside, complaining that I was too fragile. He said that, with him working all day to provide for us and still bringing me food, I should be grateful. If a wife falls ill, just giving her some food is considered care. After I escaped to the Wei family, I found that most highborn households were the same. If the master of the house was ill, the lady would personally attend to him day and night, but when the lady fell sick, only the maids took care of her while the master was nowhere to be found. It was always like this. But then I saw Wei Lin. When Wen Jiao limped and struggled to walk, he personally chose soft cotton carpets to cover every inch of her room to make it easier for her. He tasted all her meals before she ate, and he would personally coax her to drink her medicine. No matter how busy he was, he always found time to talk to her. He sought out the most renowned physicians to treat her wounds, but they all said that her injuries were too old to be completely healed. They could only improve her condition, not cure her entirely. Later, Wei Lin heard about a divine physician in Danzhou, said to be as skilled as Hua Tuo. Without hesitation, he set off on a long journey to find him. The physician said Wen Jiao couldn't withstand the bumps and jolts of a fast horse ride, so she had to travel by carriage slowly. The physician would treat other patients along the way and take his time arriving. Though it would take longer, there was finally some hope. Wei Lin, a great general, had time to do all of this. I suddenly remembered the words my husband said to me about how busy he was, and I couldn't help but find them laughable. As usual, I brought Wen Jiao her tonic, and Wei Lin naturally took it from me, blowing on it to cool it before feeding it to her. Seeing this scene, I couldn't help but express my admiration. Miss Wen is truly fortunate to have someone as wonderful as you. Wei Lin corrected me. You can't say that. Jiao is a wonderful person herself. That's right. Even 3 years ago, Wei Lin might not have been worthy of her. Though her glory has faded, we cannot deny that she was once an exceptional woman. 19. Wen Jiao became less afraid of people. Her condition improved day by day, but soon I noticed something odd. She loved to hoard food. After she began speaking on her own, she would often tell me she was hungry. I would bring her some pastries, and in the blink of an eye, the plate would be empty. One evening, after we finished dinner, I shared my concerns with Wei Lin. Since Wen Jiao trusted him, it was best that he ask her directly. After dinner, Wen Jiao tugged at my sleeve, saying she was still hungry and asking for more food. Wei Lin gently held her hand and asked, "Ah, Jiao, are you really hungry?" She lowered her eyes and nodded. We agreed not to lie to each other. "Are you trying to trick me, Ah Jiao?" She bit her lip, staying silent for a while before guiltily admitting, "I hid some. I'm saving it for others." Wei Lin asked, "Who are the others?" "I don't know many people. I can't remember exactly. But whenever we had food, we'd always hide some to share with everyone." Wei Lin fell silent. In those 3 years in Beidi, who else could she be referring to but the other women from Sheng? In that hellish place, they had supported and cared for one another, just barely managing to survive. Now, Wen Jiao was the only one left. Wei Lin hugged her, resting his chin against her neck, his shoulders trembling. Sensing his emotions, Wen Jiao cautiously asked, "Are you mad?"
I'm sorry.
"I won't do it again." Wei Lin shook his head. "No, I'm not mad. But the food you're saving won't reach them. How about I take you to deliver it to them one day?" Wen Jiao nodded hesitantly, then after some thought, she tentatively wrapped her arms around him in return.
20.
The next day, Wei Lin took Wen Jiao to the mass grave to pay respects to the innocent Sheng women who had lost their lives. I packed up the pastries she had hidden and, with Xiao Lu, bought a large amount of incense and candles. Together, we climbed the mountain with them. The mountain path was steep, so Wei Lin carried Wen Jiao on his back. When we arrived at the rows of small, raised graves, Wen Jiao visibly stiffened. Xiao Lu lit the incense and candles with practiced ease and placed them along the path. Wei Lin took the food I had packed and handed it to Wen Jiao, letting her throw it into the fire. Perhaps it was my imagination, but the moment the food was thrown into the flames, the flickering firelight reflected in Wen Jiao's pitch-black eyes. For just a second, her gaze seemed clear. Not the usual dazed and lost look, her eyes were bright, filled with immense sorrow. That wasn't the expression of someone who had lost their sanity. But in the blink of an eye, the clarity faded, and she returned to her previous state of confusion. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if I had just imagined it. 21. Wei Lin issued an order. Aside from Xiao Lu and me, no one else was allowed to enter the quarters where he and Wen Jiao stayed. Firstly, her condition was still unstable, and he feared too many people would scare her. Secondly, Wei Lin's relationship with Madame Lu was tense, and the master of the house held a strong disdain for Wen Jiao. It was better to avoid any unnecessary trouble. But living within the Wei household, there were always unforeseen events. That day, it happened to be the Prime Minister's 45th birthday, and many officials came to celebrate. Outside the courtyard, firecrackers exploded loudly, and Wen Jiao, terrified, curled up under the blankets, asking repeatedly, "Where's Wei Lin? Where did he go?" I replied, "It's the master's birthday today, so he has to attend. He'll be back soon." Wen Jiao nodded in understanding, saying she was cold and asking for some hot soup. Autumn had arrived, and the weather was getting colder. I didn't think much of it and went to the kitchen. I had no idea that in my brief absence, disaster would strike. When I returned, Wen Jiao was gone. Firecrackers continued to pop, and a sea of people filled the area. Panicking, I searched frantically and soon saw a large crowd gathered near the main hall. Wen Jiao hunched over, pulling on Wei Lin's sleeve, hiding behind him. The second young master glared at her, his eyes filled with rage, and shouted, "You're nothing but a filthy whore. What are you doing at my father's banquet, disgracing us all?" Then he charged at her, knocking her to the ground with his shoulder. Laughing triumphantly, he sneered, "You're a Beidi whore, and my brother is your customer. He's not even a proper customer, he's just picking up the trash nobody else wants." He was only 10 years old. How could he have known such cruel words unless an adult had taught him? 22. I pushed through the crowd and saw Lady Lu comforting the wailing second young master. Wei Lin kicked him away, sending him sprawling. He cried out, "Mother! Mother! Big brother hit me. He hit me because of a lowly prostitute." Lady Lu, wiping away non-existent tears, pitifully said, "Husband, you've always favored Wei Lin and ignored my son, and now, after he's been wronged like this, you still won't do anything? I know I shouldn't hold a grudge against a dead person, but my son is my life. He's just a child and said a few careless words, yet was treated like this. If Wei Lin takes over the family in the future, where will we, mother and son, find a place to survive?" Lady Lu was still the same, always playing weak to gain sympathy. A grand birthday banquet had now devolved into chaos. The guests who had come to offer congratulations exchanged looks, struggling to hold back their laughter. After all, last time, Wen Jiao's arrival had already caused quite the stir. Now, with this new spectacle, the Wei family had truly become the laughingstock of the entire capital. Wei Lin held Wen Jiao's hand and gently asked, "A Jiao, who brought you here?" Wen Jiao shrank closer to him, trembling as she extended her finger and pointed at Lady Lu. "She said you were looking for me and brought me here." Lady Lu's face turned pale. "You're lying. I've never even seen you." But why would Wen Jiao, a mentally unstable person, falsely accuse her? It was obvious to everyone that Lady Lu had intentionally let her out, solely to humiliate Wei Lin. As for who had taught the second young master, that was beyond question. It was all quite the spectacle, with the crowd watching in keen interest. Wei Lin drew his sword, pointing it at Lady Lu with a cold laugh. "Who gave you the nerve to touch her?" I held my breath. Despite everything, Lady Lu was still his mother in name. Yet Wei Lin, without hesitation, had drawn his sword against her. 23. I gave her that courage. What, do you plan on patricide now? Lord Wei's face was grim as he approached, step by step. "You ungrateful child. No matter what, she is still your mother. How dare you draw your sword against her? This family is not yours to rule yet. I've turned a blind eye to you taking Wen Jiao as a concubine, but now, for the sake of a woman who was once a military prostitute, you dare to defy me? You think you can walk all over your father now?" Wei Lin stared at him coldly, then suddenly let out a laugh. He sheathed his sword, and Lady Lu, terrified, collapsed onto the ground. Wei Lin sneered, speaking slowly, "My mother died 14 years ago. Prime Minister Wei, it was you who caused her death. Don't you remember? Do you think you're worthy? What right do you have to say these things?" At the mention of this past, Lord Wei's pupils contracted sharply. Wei Lin bent down, scooping Wen Jiao into his arms, and walked away against the flow of the crowd. That night, he packed up his things, preparing to move out of the Wei residence. He had already begun preparations for a new home after Wen Jiao's return, though he hadn't expected to leave so soon. Wei Lin asked if I wanted to join him. I had stayed at the Wei residence to repay Madame Shen's kindness, but now that Wei Lin was leaving, there was no reason for me to remain. I gathered some clothes and the silver I had saved over the years. Along the way, Wen Jiao remained quiet and obedient. I couldn't help but recall how she had pointed out Lady Lu earlier. Logically, Lady Lu wouldn't have personally lured her out. She would have sent a servant instead. If she had gone herself, being recognized would have been too obvious a mistake. Lady Lu wasn't foolish enough to make such an error. But how had Wen Jiao, who only recognized Wei Lin, me, and Xiao Lu, pointed her out so accurately? The more I thought about it, the more puzzled I became. 24. Shortly after moving out, the miraculous doctor from Danzhou arrived. I wasn't sure if this could be called a double blessing. The doctor, an elderly woman with gray hair, had a bizarre and frightening treatment method. For Wen Jiao's leg ailment, she wanted to cut open her leg to examine it, something I had never heard of before. I was worried this method would cause Wen Jiao unnecessary suffering and thought it might be better to avoid treatment. But Wei Lin was adamant. He insisted on going through with it. Luckily, 3 months later, Wen Jiao's leg had fully healed, and she walked as normally as anyone. As for the scars on her body, I wasn't sure what medicine the doctor had used, but they faded as well, leaving only faint red marks. Given time, even those would disappear. Before leaving, the doctor had a final conversation with Wei Lin. She said, "I'll be leaving today. No need to see me off, but there's something I must tell you. Wen Jiao's illness has been cured, both physically and mentally." Wei Lin, surprised, asked, "You're saying she's not insane?" "You could say that. She's not mad. In fact, she's quite clear-headed. She just doesn't want to face reality and would rather live this way." I suddenly remembered the brief clarity I had seen in Wen Jiao's eyes at the burial grounds. If she wasn't insane, then her accusation against Lady Lu made sense. Wei Lin rushed towards Wen Jiao's room, and I quickly put down my things to follow him. 25. The door was suddenly flung open, and Wen Jiao looked up in shock, as if startled. She shrank back to the edge of the bed, her eyes as hazy as ever, veiled in a mist. Wei Lin grasped her shoulders firmly and said, "You're awake, aren't you?" Wen Jiao frowned and looked up. "What are you talking about?" "You're hurting me. It really hurts." I couldn't help but speak up. "General, perhaps the doctor was mistaken. Don't scare her." Wei Lin gave a bitter smile. "Wen Jiao, as long as there is life, there is a chance to start over. Isn't that what you said to me? Look at what you're doing now. Are you really willing to live like this?" I remembered these words. Not long after Madame Shen passed away, Wei Lin had suddenly left home. That day, there was a torrential downpour that nearly flooded the entire capital. I was worried about Wei Lin's safety and searched anxiously everywhere. Finally, in the evening, he returned to the Wei residence, his body drenched and exhausted. At that time, he had been murmuring this very phrase. It turned out this was something Wen Jiao had said to him. I had wondered why they had such different personalities, yet were so drawn to each other. Little did I know that Wen Jiao had been etched into his heart since he was 7. Hearing these words, Wen Jiao's expression froze for a moment. But it was only for an instant before she reverted to her usual timid and fearful demeanor. Wei Lin stared at her, trying to find any crack in her facade. But he didn't find one. Wei Lin released her shoulders and clenched his fists tightly. He suppressed the bitterness in his throat, struggled to turn his back on her, and said, "Wen Jiao, you promised you wouldn't lie to me. You've broken your word. If you want to continue this act, fine. I'll play along with you." He was about to leave when Wen Jiao suddenly looked up and called out to him, "Wei Lin." The mist in her eyes cleared, and her gaze became bright and clear. "You were right. I've been awake for a long time. The moment I saw those graves at the burial grounds, I was already clear-headed. It turned out that Wen Jiao had been awake all along." 26. Wen Lin, can't you stop being so good to me? You should despise me, abandon me, and let me fend for myself. I'm not the same Wen Jiao I used to be. I almost killed you twice. How can I face you now? Wen Jiao covered her face, sobbing softly. Rather than having a dirty self like this recognize you, I'd rather stay mad forever. Wei Lin turned around, his eyes turbulent with emotions. He asked hoarsely, "Why do you think you're dirty? Do you think those 3,000 tribute girls who went with you are dirty?" Wen Jiao was taken aback and slowly shook her head. Wei Lin could no longer hold back and rushed over to embrace her tightly. Jiao, it's not your fault. The dirty ones are those who abused you, not you. You now represent not just yourself, but also the 3,000 tribute girls who died with resentment. You need to not only live well, but live splendidly. Tears fell drop by drop on Wei Lin's shoulder, soaking a small patch of his clothing. Wen Jiao clung to Wei Lin's neck, crying loudly in his embrace. All the days and nights of darkness in Beidi, all the pain and grievances, they all flowed out in her cries, carried by the night wind to every corner of the Shen kingdom, wailing in blood and sorrow. Even though Wen Jiao had been right under my nose all this time, it was only at this moment that I truly felt she had come alive. 27. The eldest daughter's child was born. I'm getting old and confused. She shouldn't be called the eldest daughter anymore, but Her Majesty the Empress. The emperor was very pleased and wanted to hold a grand celebration in the palace. Wei Lin, being her younger brother, naturally had to attend the palace banquet. In recent days, Lord Wei had deliberately sent people to convey messages, urging Wei Lin to come to the palace with him. After the fallout, Lord Wei probably regretted it to some extent, often testing the waters to see if he could bring Wei Lin back to the Wei residence. Wei Lin ignored all of it. This time, sending someone to deliver the message was a sign of taking the initiative to admit defeat and seek peace. But Wei Lin had no intention of acknowledging it. He took Wen Jiao and boarded the carriage to the palace. This was Wen Jiao's first major event since her recovery. She looked stunning today, dressed in moon-white silk, with a plain satin ribbon at her waist and a touch of vermilion on her brow. With just a hint of makeup, she was already a beauty that could topple a nation. As soon as Wen Jiao appeared, she became the center of attention. Standing by Wei Lin's side, every smile and frown was perfectly poised and polite. It was as if she had never been to Beidi and was still the same Wen Jiao as before, as clear and graceful as the moonlight and breeze. Coincidentally, the Wen family was seated directly opposite the Wei family. The family watched Wen Jiao, who had now returned to her former self, in shock. Especially Wen Jiao's sister, Wen Ye, who was fuming with rage. After Wen Jiao went to Beidi, the title of the first talent had fallen to her. She had a close relationship with Princess Zhaohua and had secretly plotted against Wen Jiao many times. Despite her meticulous preparations today, everyone's attention was instantly captured by Wen Jiao. Wen Ye glared at her with hatred, got up, and walked to Princess Zhaohua's side, whispering something in her ear. The princess understood and smirked, raising her voice. Everyone knows that General Wei's concubine used to play the guqin well. It's been 3 years since we last heard it. I wonder if we can hear that celestial melody again today. When Wen Jiao first returned to the Wen family, she couldn't even hold chopsticks. It wasn't that she couldn't, but she was accustomed to hastily grabbing food with her hands. Surviving in Beidi had been so tough that she hadn't cared about propriety or manners. Everyone thought Wen Jiao's hands were ruined.
28.
The princess harbored malice toward Wen Jiao because she wanted to marry Wei Lin. During a last court session, Wei Lin's remarks had embarrassed the emperor. Now, the emperor was keen to see the person Wei Lin insisted on marrying make a fool of herself. The emperor smiled. Indeed. Since such a renowned talent is here, why don't we have her play another piece and also offer a blessing for my son? Linking the performance with a blessing for the prince, if Wen Jiao's performance was poor, she might be accused of cursing the prince. Wei Lin was about to speak up to excuse her, but Wen Jiao gently shook her head, stopping him. She stood up, bowed respectfully, and took the guqin from the court musician's hands. She hadn't touched the guqin for 3 years, and no one knew how well she could play now. The air grew still, everyone holding their breath. Wen Jiao played Autumn Swan, her famous piece. The piece was complex and difficult. Wen Jiao smiled as she strummed the strings, the clear and melodious sound pouring from her fingertips, transcendent and marvelous. She played even better than she did 3 years ago. As the piece ended, applause erupted. Wen Jiao stood and calmly addressed Wen Ye, who was next to the princess. I've heard that Miss Wen is now the top talent in the capital. Since I've played, would you compose a poem to congratulate the young prince? Wen Ye's expression shifted from disdain to a deathly pale. The princess nudged her. Hurry and compose one. Aren't you good at writing poetry? Wen Ye's face was extremely ugly, and she stammered, unable to say a word. Wen Jiao smiled. She walked back to Wei Lin's side and said softly, Miss Wen, you used my unpublished poetry collection as your own work. Did you enjoy the praise? Wen Ye was enraged. You're talking nonsense. It's all my own writing. Then tell me, in the poem Mount Wen, is it about a mountain or a temple? It's a mountain. No, wait, it's a temple. Wen Jiao covered her mouth, laughing. Wrong on both counts. Mount Wen is a monk I met in a temple. If my poem mentions a temple, it doesn't mean it's about an actual temple, does it? Wen Ye's face was extremely ugly. Seeing her reputation ruined, she crazily overturned a table of food, shouting, Wen Jiao, why did you come back to life? Why don't you just die? Why, Why does everyone's attention still focus on you despite everything? I refuse to be your backdrop forever. I want to step on you and show everyone that I'm the most outstanding one. Go die, go die. I'm going to kill you, she screamed and rushed to strangle Wen Jiao. Perhaps driven mad by her anger, she collapsed with a headache before reaching Wen Jiao, unconscious. The Wen family was truly embarrassed in front of the emperor. Lord Wen and Lady Wen hurriedly had her taken away and bowed repeatedly to request an early departure. The crowd sighed. It turned out that the so-called new top talent of the capital was just a fraud who relied on Wen Jiao's poetry to gain fame. The truly talented one had always been Wen Jiao. 29. After the palace banquet, everything changed drastically. Wen Jiao's performance brought her fame, while the Wen family's reputation was ruined. The most absurd part was that Princess Xiaohua hurriedly married off soon after. It was rumored that she tried to drug Wei Lin to marry him. However, Wei Lin happened to be summoned by the empress and did not eat the drugged pastries. The pastries were consumed by another official's son, and when they were discovered, they were found in a compromising state. To quell the rumors, the emperor hastily married off the princess. The princess, unaccustomed to such humiliation, either gave her husband the cold shoulder or bossed him around. She even had her husband's mistress beaten to death, crying out daily that he prevented her from marrying Wei Lin. The husband, previously dominant in his own home, now felt degraded, even less than a servant. Driven to desperation, he ended up stabbing the princess to death with a knife. The emperor was furious, and the official's entire family was executed overnight. I stood outside the mansion, shivering as I saw soldiers dragging people to the execution grounds. Wen Jiao draped a coat over me, and I asked, "Do you know what the empress discussed with the general that day?" She smiled. "Don't worry, Grandma. Wei Lin knows what he's doing." Though she said this, I couldn't help but worry. In recent days, Wei Lin's behavior had been very abnormal. Since seeing Wei Yun at the palace banquet, he often left early and returned late, sometimes not coming home for several days. Occasionally, he would bring some brothers from the barracks home but wouldn't let anyone serve them, locking the room door behind him. It was as if he were plotting a rebellion. Images of soldiers dragging people to the execution grounds flashed through my mind, sending shivers down my spine. This was a crime punishable by extermination of the entire family. The next day, I deliberately woke up very early and stopped Wei Lin, who was about to leave. "General, before it's discovered, you should stop." Wei Lin looked at me and smiled. "Grandma, some things must be done. My sister and I have never forgotten our mother's teachings. The emperor is 15 years older than her." I strongly opposed her entering the palace. But she said she entered the palace to realize the world our mother envisioned. Now that she has given birth to the prince, I must help her wield the emperor's authority and overturn the world. Wei Lin brushed my hand aside and resolutely left. I stood there, stunned, and sighed helplessly. Madame Shen's children had grown up to be just like her. 30. To avoid interfering with Wei Lin's plans, Wen Jiao and I went to the countryside under the pretense of visiting relatives. For an entire month, we were oblivious to the news from the capital. Occasionally, we heard excited small traders from the capital saying, "General Wei has rebelled, and now the capital has a new order." Wen Jiao and I sighed in relief, the anxiety we had been holding on to finally easing. Wei Lin personally came to fetch Wen Jiao and me back. He looked considerably thinner, with visible fatigue in his eyes. Wen Jiao ran up to him with excitement, hugging him as they both cried. In the carriage, I asked, "General, what will you do about Lord Wei?" To change the dynasty, it was necessary to purge the powerful families entrenched in the court for years. The Wei family was the largest of these families in the capital. No matter how one viewed it, Lord Wei was still his father. Was he really going to be demoted and exiled? Wei Lin closed his eyes and after a long pause said, "He's dead. Lu Mantang is dead too. Their son was taken away by the Lu family to Yunzhou." Wei Lin slowly opened his eyes. "My father secretly investigated me and discovered my intentions. He came to my house to advise me. Suddenly, there were faint footsteps outside the door. When I opened it, it was Lu Mantang. She wanted my father to report me, otherwise, she would do it herself. As she was about to leave, my father pierced her heart with a sword. My father said he was sorry for my mother and could not wrong me and my sister further, so he chose to support me. At the moment of success, he took an arrow for me and asked me before he died to bury him and my mother together. I was choked up. I knew Lord Wei had always felt guilty towards Madame Shen, and after her death, he had been in a state of depression for a long time. Later, he projected all his guilt onto Madame Shen and their children, carefully nurturing them. But I never imagined he would help Wei Lin rebel to make amends for his guilt. Wei Lin's voice was calm and steady throughout. He had hated Lord Wei for years and never called him father. Now, I wondered what feelings accompanied this term, father. 31. The new ruler was the former empress, Wei Yun. With the young prince ascending to the throne, she became the Empress Dowager and took control of the court. She was decisive, implementing new policies, establishing women's imperial examinations, banning the killing of baby girls, and enforcing monogamy. She also sternly cracked down on factionalism and corruption, selecting virtuous and capable officials. Years later, the state of Sheng underwent a tremendous transformation. Everything seemed to be moving in the direction that Madame Shen had once envisioned. As for me, I was growing old. My health was deteriorating, and I feared I might not survive the coming winter. So, I secretly went to Madame Shen's tombstone with my frail body. Wei Lin had ultimately buried Lord Wei elsewhere, not allowing them to be buried together. Perhaps this was for the best, so she could rest peacefully. Heavy snow had fallen, and a thick layer covered Madame Shen's tombstone. I raised my hand to brush off the snow. I recalled that winter when a courtesan from the drunken Red House angered a guest and was thrown into the icy lake. The winter lake was bitterly cold. The courtesan struggled and cried for help, but everyone on the shore looked on indifferently. Some even sneered, "A lowly courtesan, it's deserved if she drowns." With the state in turmoil, it was time to play the guqin and sing. Madame Shen had removed her cloak and thrown it over me, and without hesitation, jumped into the icy lake. Afterward, I fed her medicine while crying, "Madam, why did you save her? Your life is much more precious." Madame Shen shook her head. Being forced into prostitution wasn't her fault, nor was singing or playing the guqin. She doesn't know why everyone blames her for everything. I can swim, so I couldn't stand by and watch. But that was the moment she caught a lingering illness. Lu Mantang took advantage of this to harm her, preventing her from surviving that winter. 32. Before Madame Shen passed away, she asked me to take her out for a walk. With an oil paper umbrella, she walked through the vast white snow, turned around and smiled warmly at me, saying softly, "Ayuan, my name is Shinji. Everyone calls me Madam, and I've almost forgotten the path I came from." As soon as she finished speaking, she suddenly fell to the ground, making a deep imprint in the snow. Her lips continually bled, turning the white snow into small patches of red, like the sparse red plums on her oil paper umbrella. Madame Shen's gaze was vacant as she stared ahead, murmuring, "This is indeed very foolish." She denied everything she had once insisted on before leaving. I leaned my head against the tombstone, smiling. "See, what you said wasn't foolish. Your children have accomplished everything you wanted to do." The sparks she ignited had blessed future generations. I slowly closed my eyes, feeling life slip away bit by bit. Suddenly, I heard, "Grandma." Then many people came rushing towards me. It was Wei Lin and the others searching for me. I used my last bit of strength to raise my lips. "My life has been quite good." Wei Lin's children are adorable, calling me grandmother in sweet voices. The young emperor is also well-behaved and well-educated. Though my only daughter was drowned, I have children and grandchildren around me, enjoying my old age. Most importantly, I was fortunate enough to witness the world Madame Shen once envisioned. No, she didn't like being called Madam. "So, Shunji, have you returned home? I wonder if I will still be able to see you after coming so late." Shen Ji side story from Wei Yun's perspective. My mother's surname was Shen, and her given name was Ji. But everyone only knew her as Madame Shen. A courtesan she had saved came to see me, saying she wanted to write a biography about her. I put down my teacup, and my thoughts drifted back to an afternoon many years ago, with the sky filled with rosy light. She had taken the women's etiquette book from my hands and thrown it on the ground, saying, "Yunner, don't read these books that discipline women."
1.
After the successful rebellion, ruling from behind the curtain kept me extremely busy. I had to handle all sorts of state affairs, and Wei Lin was occupied with caring for Wen Jiao, so he couldn't help much. Wen Jiao had a difficult labor and suffered through a whole night of pain. Basin after basin of blood was carried out, and Wei Lin, coming out from the delivery room, sat dejectedly in a corner, slapping himself and saying he never wanted children again. Giving birth for a woman is like walking through the gates of hell. I stood outside, equally anxious. Fortunately, heaven showed mercy and did not separate these lovers who had endured so much. But Wen Jiao was in a low mood for a long time after giving birth, and Wei Lin was busy taking care of the baby and cheering her up. The burden on my shoulders increased greatly, and I was overwhelmed. When I heard that the famous writer Bao and wanted to see me, my first thought was that she wanted to recommend her new book. When I wasn't so busy, I loved listening to storytellers. Among the most popular writers today, Bao N was unmatched. Her books, full of vivid and interesting stories, had become a sensation throughout the Shen kingdom. If it had been before, I would certainly have agreed to meet her. But recently, I was extremely busy with state affairs, and I was about to ask the palace servants to send her away. The servant said, "Your Majesty, she claims to have been a courtesan at Drunken Red House, and that your mother saved her. She wants to write a biography about her." When I was 12, my mother had fallen ill while saving a courtesan. Lu Mantang had secretly swapped out a medicine prescribed by the doctor, causing her death. And now, the renowned writer Bao An was actually that courtesan my mother had saved? I immediately put down what I was holding and summoned her to see me.
2.
The visitor looked much younger than I had imagined. After all, she was only 16 when she was thrown into the icy lake, just 4 years older than me at the time. Upon seeing me, Bao En seemed momentarily dazed. She stared for a long time before murmuring, "You and Madame Shen really look alike." Yes, we do resemble each other. After my mother's death, my father often looked at me and lamented how much I resembled her. I asked, "Since you want to write a biography about my mother, you may ask whatever you wish. I will answer honestly." Bao En nodded, sat down across from me, and began to prepare ink with a brush and paper she had brought. Only then did I notice that her 10 fingers had no nails, just a thin, blood-like membrane. I frowned. Before I could ask, Bao En smiled and said, "When I was still a courtesan, I was the most favored courtesan at Drunken Red House, deeply liked by young Master Chu from the Chu family. He especially liked to hear me play the guqin and sing. Lord Chu thought I was seducing him, so he ordered someone to pull out my fingernails. The first time, my nails grew back after 3 months, and he had them pulled out again and they never grew back. Coincidentally, a guest that day specifically requested me to play the guqin. Seeing my hands were ruined, he wouldn't give up. I had no choice but to play for a while, but soon my fingers were bloodied and couldn't move. In his rage, he carried me and threw me down from the building. So it was like that on that day? When my mother died, I had some resentment towards that courtesan I had never met. I always felt that if my mother had not jumped in to save her, she wouldn't have fallen ill, and Lu Mantang wouldn't have had the chance to harm her. Now I finally understood her choice. If I had been there that day, I would have jumped without hesitation. Seeing me frown and remain silent, Bao En sighed and said, "That was many years ago. The Shen kingdom is now peaceful and stable under your and General Wei's governance. There are no more courtesans in brothels, and no one dares to use such inhumane methods anymore." Her way of holding the brush was awkward. The injury from having her nails pulled out had permanently affected her. No one would have thought that the highly esteemed writer had a disability, making it difficult for her to hold a brush. I paused and slowly asked, "How did you become a courtesan?"
3.
Bao and lowered her gaze and gave a bitter smile. I never saw my mother from birth. My father was a storyteller in a tavern. I followed him every day, carrying a tray to collect tips from guests. Listening to those old stories from a young age, I dreamed of writing something more interesting when I grew up. But when I was 9, my father was beaten to death. The person who killed him claimed that my father's stories were meant to mock him. The authorities came to arrest people, but they just accepted some silver to settle the matter. I was dragged and coerced into a brothel, where I was taught the arts of music, chess, and calligraphy for a few years. I started seeing clients at 13. I was fortunate. At 16, Madame Shen helped to redeem me. She looked up and said lightly, "But that's all in the past. I've fulfilled my childhood dreams, writing books that people love." How much do you know about Madame Shen's story?
4.
I don't want to elaborate on the story between my parents. In short, my father met my mother when he was down and out, and she rescued him. He admired her peculiar ideas and fresh perspectives. As time passed, affection grew, and my father once promised that having her was enough for a lifetime. My mother believed him. But later, he wanted more power, status, everything. A lonely orphan girl in Shen Kingdom couldn't give him the support he wanted. So, my father got involved with Lu Mantang. On the day they confronted each other, my mother, in tears, asked him why. My father impatiently replied, "Did you really think I agreed with what you said? I was just indulging in something new. You've already had 2 children and have no support. Where else can you go? Don't push your luck." I remember from that day on, my mother rarely smiled. She often stared into space. Later, when Lu Mantang entered the household, her cruel nature and her ability to feign pity caused my father to favor her in everything. Only after my mother's death did my father realize the depth of his pain. But it was too late to regret. My father poured all his guilt onto me and Wei Lin.
5.
I took a sip of tea and said dumb and dull, "It's just a story of a heartless person and a sorrowful person. There's nothing much to remember." Bao and nodded. "I'll generally omit that part. How would you describe your mother?" "What kind of person was my mother?" Lu Mantang said she was foolish. My father said she was silly. People mocked her for her fanciful ideas. But I only remember that afternoon with the sky filled with rosy light. My mother took the women's etiquette book from my hands and threw it on the ground, saying, "Yunner, don't read these books that discipline women." She taught me to be independent, to not regard a husband as everything, and to strive for self-reliance. She also taught me that everyone is equal and one shouldn't bully others or look down on them. My mother once described another world to me. In that world, women could go to school and be educated alongside men without disdain. They could wear whatever clothes they liked and advocate for love based on freedom. In that world, men could only marry one wife and couldn't have concubines. It was a monogamous society. Women could hold official positions, engage in business, and be in the public eye. My mother said she came from that world. I wanted to go there too, but my mother said we couldn't go for now. She was still looking for a way back. Under her teachings, Wei Lin, and I grew up longing for that world. My mother said if we could go back, she would take us with her. But we never waited for that day. When my mother passed away, she held my hand tightly, saying she was foolish. She also entrusted me to teach the women's learning and women's etiquette that she hadn't taught me yet, and to teach Wei Lin the rights of rulers and ministers. She said the things she taught us wouldn't work in this world. After saying her last words, she looked longingly at me and Wei Lin and closed her eyes forever. I didn't even feel the tears flow. I only felt a warmth on my cheeks. At that time, my only thought was that if these things didn't work here, I would create a new world where they could. I diligently learned everything my mother had taught me and entered the palace with determination. The emperor was 15 years older than me, and Wei Lin was adamant that I shouldn't go. I pushed his hand away and said firmly, "Do you remember the world our mother described to us? I am going to make it a reality." Only then did Wei Lin let go. He also proved his worth, never losing a battle and gaining more military power. In fact, the emperor had long harbored intentions to eliminate the Wei family, planning to strip away their power step by step. But before he could act, I poisoned him. The rebellion was a success, and I fulfilled my mother's vision, realizing everything she wanted to achieve. 6. As the evening shadows lengthened, Bowen had been listening for a long time, her pen scratching on paper. The twilight shone in at a slant, reminiscent of that afternoon. Bowen noted down what I said and finally asked, "If you could see Madame Shen again, is there anything you would like to say to her?" I looked up at the fiery red sunset and said softly, "I miss her very much. If I could see her again, I would tell her that I miss her. She was the kindest, most special person in this world. And she was my most respected mother." Bowen put away her pen and organized the papers, smiling as she said, "All right, I've noted that down. My only dream now is to help Madame Shen compile a book. Such a person shouldn't be obscure in history. I plan to go to other places, visit more people, and learn more about Madame Shen." I stood to see her off. Before she left, I asked, "And is that your real name?" She paused and replied, "En means to repay kindness." I had no name before. I was called Diu when I wasn't at Drunken Red House, and Huanyang when I was there. But the moment Madame Shen saved me, I got my own name. I watched her departure, my thoughts surging. From being a despised courtesan to becoming a celebrated writer with popular stories. Free from oppression and prejudice, a courtesan could shine brightly. If Bowen's biography were to be passed down through the ages, would my mother see herself in the historical record someday? I hope she could see it, but I also hope she doesn't. If she had foreseen her own end, what kind of faith and courage did she hold when she chose this path?